So we're going to work with a document called Joy in the Gospel. It was issued by Pope Francis in November. It's filled with his pastoral concern and his challenge to politicians. And that's what got us to do this briefing. So
let me say something about his background. This is probably the first pope who ever had a scientific education. He was trained as a chemist before he entered the seminary. He's not an economist, he's not a politician, he's not a diplomat. He was a scientist before he became a priest. He grew up in Argentina, of course. This is the country of Perón, both Peróns. This is a country which had a military dictatorship, a dirty war. He lived through some terrible times. He actually had an interest in politics as a very young man. In fact, he got in trouble in school for wearing a Perón button over his uniform. So this is a man who was concerned about, interested in politics from a very young age. He split with the Perón people when actually they split, but that's a whole other story. As Archbishop of Buenos Aires, we see this man visiting the slums, walking through the slums, sitting in the homes of poor people, listening to their stories, listening to them talking about how they needed jobs, and how they couldn't feed their families because they couldn't find work. So we're going to hear heavy on his agenda. He also listened to mothers who were worried about their daughters walking home from school and being kidnapped and trafficked. I mean, this is a big problem for young women in the slums of Buenos Aires. So he became a leader in Argentina against human trafficking. Very important. And, sitting in those homes, walking through those slums, he became a real critic of capitalism and the free market system. It ain't working. It ain't working. Poor people are still poor. They're marginalized. They're forgotten. And he felt it was his role to be that prophetic voice for the poor. So this is the man that Pope Francis is. I should also say, of course, he was a Jesuit. And his Jesuit background, I think, also feeds into this because after the Second Vatican Council, we made a great commitment to the service of faith through the promotion of justice. And so he was very much on board with this agenda of the Jesuits. So I think I've introduced Pope Francis, set the stage for him, and now I'll hand it over to the people who can tell you what Pope Francis has been saying.
Thank you.
So first, he invites us to make a preferential option for the poor. In his words, and perhaps even more clearly in the way he lives his life, Pope Francis reminds us that God's heart has a special place for those who are living in poverty, and that we too are called to open our hearts to those who are neglected. Francis is clear in this section about why this preferential option for the poor is essential. And it's as simple as this. It's because of Jesus the Christ, who himself became poor, whose closest friends were impoverished and cast out by those in power, the Christ who turned conventional wisdom on its head, who welcomed the sinner, who called the last to be first, and who invited women to be his disciples. That's why we seek to transform the structures and the laws in this society that privilege a few and impoverish so many. That's why we concern ourselves with those who are left out, those who are left behind. And Francis is also very clear about who has the first claim on our hearts and our energies. It's the homeless, the addicted, the refugees, the indigenous peoples and the elderly. It's the migrants for whom Francis urges a generous openness with the hope that we will become, in his words, welcoming communities. Pope Francis speaks, as Tom said, about those people who he knows from Argentina, the victims of trafficking and other forms of slavery. And he reminds us of our own silent complicity in their bondage. And he challenges us to be particularly mindful of women and girls who so often face a double impoverishment. So those are the people who have the first claim on our hearts and on our resources. As Francis says, and I quote, "If we who are God's means of hearing the poor turn deaf ears to their plea, we oppose God's plan." And I would add that we deny that spark inside each of us that makes us most human, and we deny that which is best about this nation we call home.
Good. Francis talks about peace not as the mere absence of violence or war, but that demands the concern for the poor, equitable distribution of wealth, and the full range of human rights as laid out in the UN Declaration of Rights. And such justice comes through peacemakers who turn their swords into plowshares. Creative, nonviolent practices of engaging conflict and seeing everyone in their deepest dignity. Francis sees conflict as an opportunity for growth, for deeper unity. So practices like truth and reconciliation commissions or restorative justice processes bring out this growth and deeper unity. He says communion is possible if we see others in their deepest dignity. That is, if we preserve the peace of the truth in all parties. So this includes seeing the deepest dignity of people like Saddam, of Assad, of Putin. And about negotiations that focus on meeting human needs more so than grasping for interest or strategic influence in an area. So the reality is that we are increasingly discovering how interconnected we are. So to let this reality guide our ideas and our values. So for example, the idea of the national interest needs the common good. In fact, it may even be better to replace it with the common good. The idea of national security needs human and shared security. In fact, security is ultimately in our God. As far as we grow in love and truth, then we enter into the security of lasting life. So we end with the joy of the gospel is that God desires none of God's little ones be lost. The good shepherd finds the lost sheep. So Francis is no utilitarian. He's not sacrificing the few for the many. Or is he ensuring the privilege of the few by sacrificing the many? So this is a no to torture. The Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA torture should be released. And a no to killing.
Pope Francis is challenging us to build bridges and make a government that works together for the 100%. And right now, that's kind of been a heretical thought in our polarized reality. And Pope Francis's challenge is to exercise a modicum of tenderness and bring us together for the 100%. Now, I would like to propose 3 bold challenges. Pope Francis challenges Democrats to not just work for safety net programs, but rather for economic structural change that reduces the need for safety net programs. Don't dismantle them till we don't need them, however. Pope Francis challenges Republicans to protect the safety net while we're working on structural change, but to use the market regulation for greater equality. We know that there's been this huge income gap and huge wealth gap in our nation. Those were policies that created that reality. Pope Francis is challenging Republicans and Democrats to come together and peace build, to create and regulate markets so that we reduce that gap and reduce the suffering in our society. And that leads to the challenge to the 100% to engage and dialogue to build consensus for economic reform. Here's the heresy, the current political heresy. We've got to talk to each other. Pope Francis says we cannot ignore differences. And his challenge of peace building, his challenge of economic development, his challenge as a Jesuit, where Jesuits even find a chance to have different folks in their community and find ways to talk together. Pope Francis's political challenge to us is to find a way to build the bridges to make what we would say in our constitutional language is a more perfect union. Now, we're doing this briefing because of faith and because Francis, I like to call him Frank, but Francis is very popular, and we think this is a chance for us to make progress in our society. We do it from faith, but where we meet is the Constitution. And in the Constitution, we, the people of the United States, need to form this more perfect union. I think Pope Francis lays out some really good ways to move forward. Engage with tenderness, engage the other, build peace in solidarity. We could have more effective governance that then does do the challenging work of protecting the most vulnerable, which in the end will make us all better people and a better society.